for. Uh, he's not interested in just pushing for native sovereignty because that's already to buy into a land relationship that is supremacist on the part of our species. And so up in the court questions that native folk are pursuing, it's a struggle because you push for the recognition in the legal structure of the country for sovereign native rights, but in the process, you also then reinforce human domination of land and the more than human world. So that's a question we could get into, but I'll supply a deep history, as already mentioned, about what's going on in Palestine. Back behind that is the doctrine of discovery question, or doctrine of Christian discovery, animation of Euro settlers coming over beginning in 1492 to Turtle Island, renaming it the Americas, and then grabbing up land while working to eliminate or push west the indigenous inhabitants already there, and doing so solely initially in the name of being Christians, the understanding inside medieval Christianity that supposedly God owns the whole planet, so the representatives of God on the planet own all the land even before they get there. And Euro folk coming over here, then presuming they alone had rights to impose sovereignty on the land. And in the legal cases that began to unfold, particularly with Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823, wrote into property law the understanding that only those who are Christian have a right to buy and sell the land and claim sovereign ownership rights of it. Other folk, native folk, only have occupation rights at the pleasure of those real owners. And in the process of having that written into property law, beginning with Johnson v. McIntosh, the Christian piece was quickly disguised under other language, priorities of discovery, of civilization, and so on. But in effect, the only reason any of us who are non-native have a piece of legal paper claiming we have ownership rights of the land we live on is because we're connected to this Christian venture. None of us really have legal title from a native point of view. So that's a whole piece of this. And we look at Gaza now and what's going on there as a kind of post-conquest preoccupation. In effect, we eliminated all of our Palestinians here, native folk, to the tune of 95% from the top of Canada to the bottom of South America. And we are the achievement of that kind of colonial takeover, settler colonial takeover, and pretty much take it for granted as we look around the world and as we look in the mirror. And we are what the current Israeli initiative in Palestine would look like if it succeeded in totally wiping out Palestinians, which is probably why our political leaders are so supportive of what Israel is doing. But that's a whole piece of the deep history. And then back behind that is, what is Christianity? Why does it think it's supreme and, able to take over land all over the planet? And then back behind that is an even deeper question for Lily and I about land itself and the whole project of civilization going back 5,000 years. When we first started to organize ourselves in city-state systems presided over by elites, commandeering all of the surrounding biomass and land base as resource through forced labor, coerced to generate surplus. And so the deep question for us from a case point of view for Dr. Mendoza and I is the question of sustainability and our reading of the deep history as not being sustainable once we opted to organize ourselves in these larger settlements called city-states, and then nation-states, and then empires that has rolled over the planet for the last 5,000 years, pretty much coercing every other way of living, hunting and gathering, subsistence agriculture, and small-scale pastoralism and pastoral nomadism into that way of doing monocrop agriculture presided over by elites, and then industrialization as we get up into the 17 and 1800s. So that's what this talk was based on, was walking back through this history. We really only got through the Palestinian sovereignty in that hour and a half. This is another way of organizing it here, is to ask, when we talk settler colonialism, starting where we are right now, what shows up on our TV and social media screens, is the question of supremacy, which it embodies and encodes. And so initially, the question of Israeli settler state, settler colonial state, and the Jewish supremacy, coded as Zionism, that it embodies. Back behind that, supporting that, and actually alongside it, is U.S. settler colonial state and the supremacy it embodies, white supremacy, ongoing. Back behind that is Roman imperial settler colonialism and the Christian supremacy it quickly began to embody, starting particularly in 312 with Constantine. And then back behind that is the civilizational city-state colonialism and elite or human or species supremacy that I would suggest is embodied in that civilizational project, which has never proven sustainable anywhere on the planet. And we can arrange all of that in a question in relationship to the sovereignty that identifies what is the particular question of sovereignty underneath each of those forms of settler colonial imposition. Palestinian sovereignty, Turtle Island sovereignty, pagan sovereignty, pastoral nomad sovereignty, back under the Roman imposition, and then way back, small-scale agriculture, pastoral nomad, hunter-gatherer, questions of sovereignty. All of that leading to, for Dr. Mendoza and I, a question about indigenous peoples' sovereignty or land-taught lifestyles. The word indigenous, I recognize, is embattled. I use it, but I also am willing not to use it. But I do want to talk about a particular lifestyle that is different from civilization, that is not bent on surplus, but is bent on what today we're starting to call a circular economy, that is really paying attention to the whole realm of recycling, that there is no, in the natural world, there is no thing called waste, garbage, no place to put stuff that we have made toxic, but rather to live in such a way you're not toxifying your environment in the way you relate to the more than human world. And embedded in that is a land without people sovereignty. Does the land have the right to its own sovereignty apart from our species before we came on the scene? Yes, I would say, but again, I want to put the word sovereignty in brackets and interrogate it about, is that the word we really want to use, because it embodies this sense of rulership. I'd rather use biodiversity, where no species is in charge, no species is ruling over another. Yes, there are key species in particular local ecologies, but that's a different thing. Where are we in this thing called civilization? 70% drop in wildlife population since 1970. Agriculture threatens the habitat of 90% of animal species by 2050. 83% loss of wild mammals, 50% of fish since civilization began. It's not viable. Skip over this. Let's get into Palestine. We're talking about the Fertile Crescent historically, and of course the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, built in some fairly big part on a certain understanding of who Sarah and Abraham are, or Abram and Sarai, whose family line traces to Mesopotamia, up to Haran, and then down into present-day Palestine, the Eastern Mediterranean Levant. That deep history, in coming to grips with that history and what's going on today, what I want to go through, would want to grapple with is, what do you see? What will you do? And of course, somebody like Aaron Bushnell says, I refuse to be complicit anymore. I will make my life a quick protest of everything going on, because from his point of view, as far as we understand, it's not worth living when you're living on the back of dead bodies that you're participating in putting under rubble or 6 feet into a grave. If you pay taxes, you're involved, simply by virtue of what our country does in supplying the bombs and the arms. For me, the Palestine-Israel question is a litmus test now involving an entire globe because of social media, and certainly for our involvement because of funding weapons. Are we front seat witnesses to apartheid, to ethnic cleansing, to genocide? What do we mean by these terms, and who says, who gets to say? So the first part of that is the historical piece, who is doing what, and the second part of it is, what are the terms, what is the language, the lens by which we see this history, and who is doing what to whom. So coming to grips with that, one of the deep questions is, what is a Palestinian and what is a Jew? What do those terms reference? And part of the discourse that gets thrown around on the Israeli side is the charge of anti-Semitism, now being articulated as so encompassing that to be anti-Zionist or anti-Israeli state is ipso facto to be anti-Semite. But the word Semite itself is actually a linguistic term, and it encompasses Hebrew speakers and Arabic speakers. Technically, in the use of that term, Palestinians are also Semites. And so what Israel is doing is itself anti-Semitic. If you want to say, yeah, well, the term began as a linguistic term, but now it's come to mean something more like an ethnic designation of bloodline, and you get into then the genealogy of the people involved. And here are just culling from the Wikipedia footnotes, the research that's been done that would say, on average, very often, depending on the population you're actually looking at on the ground in Palestine, Palestinians and Jews share 75% of their gene stock. In many ways, they are the same people back in deep history, but who lived through different histories. Once Rome rolled in and cleared out Israel post-Babylonian exile, we'll look at that briefly in just a minute, in 70 AD, and Israel ceased to exist as a nation state, many people had already been going into exile, and more went into exile around the globe, into Europe, various places, North Africa, going east as well. Other people stayed there, living as subsistence agriculturalists or Bedouin pastoral nomad folk, and they live very different histories. So by the time you get up 2,000 years to now, the folk who stayed put there experienced Islam rolling into the neighborhood after the death of Muhammad in 632, and became, for the most part, Muslims, whereas Jewish folk elsewhere remained Jewish. Some folk remained Jewish in Palestine as well. And now they're back in this cookpot that we currently see. So again, if we are going to talk about the Israeli Jewish side, which traces its roots back to Abraham and Sarah, real quickly, what they are part of, beginning roughly around 1800 BCE, is they are part of the first social resistance movement our species ever mobilized on the planet. Resistance to the city-state system that becomes known as civilization as it rolls across the planet. Initially in Mesopotamia and Egypt, in China, in places later on in Africa, in Central America. As our species began to organize in these bigger settlements, presided over by hierarchy, a ruling class of elites making decision on behalf of everybody else and commandeering the surplus product of the labor, the cultivators, and the animal products that everybody else was forced to provide for them, that resistance began to happen. And the herders in particular, who were integrated forcibly into that city-state economy, had an advantage over cultivators because the herders could walk out with their herd animals and not go back. Say, sayonara, I don't need you. I can eat without you. If you're going to resist a social formation, a political order, the big question is, what are you going to eat? Can you survive outside the ambit of the economic organization of that political order? Peasant cultivators couldn't. They could leave, but they'd have to plant seeds and wait 6 months, and they'd die before they could eat. Not so herders. Herders can go out and be integrated into the semi-arid steppe lands around the cultivated areas in these city-state systems, and their animals integrate them immediately into the environment, providing them milk, providing them later on meat, bones for tools, et cetera, et cetera. So pastoral nomadism, pastoralists who were part of this economy became nomads, wandering, learning a different relationship with land, a more integrated, sustainable relationship with land. Pastoral nomads also could become imperial, like the Mongols. They could collaborate with city-state systems as mercenaries, as border guards, et cetera, and did so. But some of them also remained independent, autonomous, living a more respectable, integrated, sustainable lifestyle in relationship to their grasslands and trying to keep away from city-state aggression. Abram and Sarai were part of that. The very first thing we're told in the biblical tradition about what becomes Jewishness and Israel is Abram and Sarai are told to leave to leave actually Haran, where the family had gravitated to leave the city. And they do. And they become pastoral nomads, and their offspring are pastoral nomads, and their offspring are pastoral nomads. And then famine occurs, and some of those pastoral nomads end up going down to Egypt, where the Nile regularly inundates its banks, so it's possible to survive even drought conditions. And they're down there and end up enslaved, and Moses leads them out, and et cetera. And Israel, in its earliest formation as a nation-like entity, is actually a pastoralist herder tribal alliance in the spiny hill country in Canaan between the Jordan River and Dead Sea and the Mediterranean. And it's resisting city-state aggression coming from the Mediterranean seaboard. And part of the anomaly of Israel is that it's a group of mixed multitude coming out from slavery in Egypt, led by Moses and then Joshua, coming into that region across the Jordan from east to west, from the more desert-like terrain in present-day Jordan, into Canaanite area. And in the reports that we have in the biblical tradition, but also archaeologically, the report is with some of the people who were there, they fought, and with others of the people there, they allied or went into a covenant agreement. With whom did they fight and with whom did they ally? Well, the reading of it is they allied with Canaanite peasants who were exiting the Canaanite city-state systems on the Mediterranean seaboard, all up and down here, and going up into the rocky interior because iron technology had been introduced for the first time. It became possible to cultivate small scale up in this elevated area away from these city-state systems. And the peasant said, sayonara, I don't need you anymore. I can go with a few herd animals and do small scale agricultural up there. And they were doing that before Joshua and Moses and company arrived. Moses didn't cross. He died before coming out of the wilderness wandering period. And Joshua came over and voila, you get Israel. It's a name that has a God up inside the name. What God is inside the name Israel? El. It's a Canaanite God. What you have is a mixed group of folk, partially the group coming from Abram and Sarai, and some other folk who were not coming from their bloodline in Egypt, wandering and coming after 40 years into this mix, and then further mixing themselves and amalgamating with Canaanite peasantry rebelling from city-state systems, forming Israel, worshiping YHWH. Primarily a lifestyle option, not an ethnic group, not a bloodline at that point in time. It didn't become a bloodline until after the Babylonian exile. So again, Abram, Sarai, and Egypt, ancestors are and down here, an experiment in sort of recovering relationship with the land, small-scale agriculture and pastoral nomadism, then a fateful choice after about 200 years to organize themselves in a city-state system, understood in the tradition as betrayal, resistance to that, 2 different exiles, comes back, the people come back, and mostly the elites are carted off into exile, come back from the Babylonian exile under Persian sponsorship, and Israel exists for the next 500 plus years as a colonized third world country, colonized first by Persia, then by Greece, then by Rome. And during the Roman period, there's a big rebellion, the Zealot Rebellion in 64, the Common Era. Rome rolls in, destroys everything in sight. Israel ceases to exist as a nation state in 70 of the Common Era. And then we're into the 2,000-year history of Jewish folk as basically landless, weaponless, forced to be anarchistic in effect, folk living among other empowered, weaponized, militarized formations all over the globe and surviving. Already in Europe, by 145, you have vilification of Jews as God killers, as deicides by Justin Martyr, a Christian theologian. By 626, that's resulted in expulsion of Jews from France and then from other places in Europe. The scapegoating of Jews is beginning to become a common feature of Christian polities all over that part of the world, where a drought is experienced, a famine is experienced, an outbreak of disease is experienced. The instant explanation is to scapegoat the Jews and say the reason we're experiencing this is because we're tolerating God killers in our midst. We need to kill them off or at least exile them. And that becomes an ongoing phenomenon visited on these Jewish populations who are in exile. By the 18th century, it's called a pogrom. You could use the word, I think, basically accurately in relationship to something that begins much earlier. But Christian violence directed against Jews becomes characteristic of the relationship from that point forward, designated in the color-coded schema here in red. The underlying violence visited on Jewish people again and again and again and again. Islam emerges, as I mentioned, out of the Hijaz, Mecca and Medina, Muhammad, as a particular pan-Arabic movement that quickly goes international. moves north up into Israel and ultimately up into Turkey, east through Iraq and Iran and down into Afghanistan and northern India and even over into the Philippines, goes west into Egypt and across the northern African landscape into Libya and Algeria and up into Spain by 711. Islam has taken over all of Spain but the northern corridor. And a century or so in begins an experiment that comes to be called the convivencia, a kind of amazing experiment in cross-cultural, cross-religious exchange and toleration sponsored by Islam for 2.5 centuries, the like of which has never been seen in Europe ever since. So Islam ends up being integral to Europe for 700 years, from 711 to 1492, and the author of an amazing experiment for more than 250 years. That's twice as long as this country's been around. Islam is not foreign to Europe from that point of view. But of course, more fundamentalist Christian folk up in Castile in the northern region of Spain, more fundamentalist Islamic folk in northern Africa don't like it, push on it, battle each other. Christian concern particularly is to reconquer Spain. That goes on over this whole period of time, battle after battle after battle, until finally 1492 marks the year when the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain, is completed by Ferdinand and Isabella. All of the remaining Jews and Muslims either killed or exiled and forced to leave their goods behind or forcibly converted. But in any case, Islam as this kind of amazing presence inside Europe ends at that point in time effectively, and again, color-coded in red as Christian violence now directed against Islam. So Christianity authoring both Islamophobia and, if you want to use the term, anti-Semitism early on in this history and consistently ever after. And those are the underlying forms of violence that I think we're witnessing today in Palestine, that falls at the feet of those of us who are Western located and informed by, if not embracing, this thing called Christianity. In terms of what we see going on right now, the more modern roots of it, a fundamentalist Christian named Andrew Keith comes up with the phrase, a land without people for a people without land, which was not true, but in his imagination was. That it gains traction, particularly under Theodor Herzl, who convenes the first Zionist Congress in 1897, begins the settlements. Of course, by 1914, you have the outbreak of World War I, allies against the Central Powers in part Ottoman Turks who've been living and ruling in that part of the world for centuries at that point in time. You have the figure Lawrence of Arabia, who figures out how to learn from, live like, and cooperate with Arab Bedouin in the Levant, in Palestine, in such a way that they contribute to the Allied victory in an amazing way. And they're then entirely carved out of the settlement of that world war in 1918 and effectively made subject to what becomes known as the British Mandate, built on the Balfour Declaration of 1917, that makes the area of present-day Palestine and the Levant, Eastern Mediterranean, into a mandated reality presided over colonially by Britain. And it confers religious, civil, and political rights on Jews who have begun to settle into the area. Early 20th century, the percentages are about 7% Jewish and 93% non-Jewish Arab-speaking folk in Palestine. the Jewish percentage increases continuously as Jews coming out of this history of violence and trauma say, I want to get where I'm not under other people. I want some land under my feet. And the kibbutz movement is part of that. This British mandate, conferral of rights, also confers religious and civil rights on Arab-speaking non-Jews, but not political rights. It does not, in its language, entertain that they will one day be a state, and does not give them, therefore, rights of self-determination. By 1936 through 39, Arabs are revolting. They can see what is happening with the Jewish population there, as well as the British colonists who were present, and they're not having it. And Britain implements martial law for everybody there, and in the process of the resistance, 5,000 Arabs end up dead, Jews and British folk, 562 dead. But the effect of the revolt is to push Britain to start to envision in a white paper a binational state, rather than just conferring the possibility of statehood on the future horizon for Jewish people. But World War II interrupts, so that white paper is never implemented. And then we're into what we see more immediately today, which looks like this. The 1947 UN Resolution 181, coming out the other side of World War II, envisions two states. Jews, who are at that point 1/3 of the population, are given 50% of the land in that resolution. Palestinians, who are 2/3 of the population, are given 44% of the land. Israel begins to come into being as a result, accepts that settlement. The Arab states in the area do not. War breaks out, and Arab-Israeli war. The Israel state expands in the process of winning that war to 78% of the land, Palestinians 22% of the land. The Nakba takes place, in Arabic, the catastrophe, where 750,000 Palestinians all over Palestine are forced out of their homes, their villages, their towns, and relocated in Gaza and the West Bank and Golan Heights. Coming out the other, and in addition to the displacement, there's massacre of all kinds. The Israeli state, newly born, continues British martial law, but now imposed only on non-Jewish people present. They enact other laws for themselves in the process of becoming a democratic state for Jews. There are curfews, there's travel restrictions, there's expulsion, there's refugees, there's imprisonment. All of that becomes characteristic of the occupation of the territory and reorganization of that territory by Israel, newly formed, color-coded here as yellow. And then you get the ongoing conflict around that situation. And the way I talk about it is, imagine I come to your front door one day, knock on the door, and I've got behind me the largest gang in your area, in your state, bristling with weapons. And I say, sorry, we are now taking over your house. You will live in your backyard. And indeed, you'll live in only 44% of it. We're taking 56% of it, and we're going to live in the house. What would you do? Well, you resist. So then this force says to you, at the end of the resistance, after putting you down, you now have 22% of the land. We've got 78%. We're going to monitor and police the borders and increasingly control even what happens in that 22%. And that has been the situation ever since. Under martial law for those people in that 22% until the Six-Day War, 1967, when Israel takes over 100% of the land. And in Arabic, it's known as the Naksa, the setback. 300,000 more displaced, 100,000 Syrians, and that provokes UN Resolution 242, which says, oh, let's go back to the previous arrangement, 78% and 22%. That is not adequate for Arab-speaking Palestinians who are still out in their backyard, living in tents, living hand to mouth. Yeah, they're starting to build concrete structures, but they are not home. They are displaced, but able to see people who are occupying their home and living a lifestyle very different than their own, free to be upwardly mobile, to be educated, and so on. And so you have another outbreak of war. And again, this is a complex history, and I'm just skipping through it to give the overview. The Arab-Israeli War of 1973. The PLO had already emerged in 1964 under what happened coming out of 1948. Israel wins the 73 war, in effect. By 1982, PLO has gone north of the border into Syria and Lebanon area. Israel invades Lebanon to shut down PLO, attacks, no suicide bombings until 1994, no rocket attacks till 2001. It's people coming over the border and doing their acts of resistance. You have the Sabra Shatila refugee camp massacres, somewhere between 800 and 350 or 3,500 people killed. The big thing about this moment in this whole history is it's televised for the first time. And all of a sudden, Israel is appearing on the global stage, no longer as a little David up against a big Goliath of Arab states, but now as itself the Goliath and dominating a little David called Palestinians. And Israel recognizes it has a PR problem. And by 1984, it has implemented what it calls Hasbara, the explaining, even ultimately will run a show called The Ambassador, modeled on Donald Trump's Apprentice, to have people come and offer their best version of explaining why Israel gets to rule this land the way it does. And then whoever wins that becomes part of the official PR initiative. By 1987, you have the first intifada in reaction to that, in resistance to that occurring. It's shut down. You have the attempt at a two-state solution, the Oslo Accords, but Israel's already a de facto state. Palestinians are offered the prospect of a state with all kinds of limitations. Only in the future, they resist. Second Intifada, 2000. By 2005, coming out the other side of that, you have Israel agreeing to clear out 21 settlements from Gaza. And this gets taken up in the Hasbara explaining in the Western media, a very sophisticated PR campaign, because Israel recognizes it has to keep American support active and alive and committed, which means in effect, occupying the American mind with their understanding of the narrative. And they managed to do that very well. So this gets represented as Israel walking away from occupying Gaza and conferring freedom as a prospect on Gaza residents who themselves are refugees from the original Nakba. But that's a fictional understanding. And even Israeli intellectuals and public officials will call what is left in Gaza after 2005 as either a concentration camp or an outdoor prison. If the guards walk out of the prison cell of the prisoners, they can't turn around and say, oh, you're now free. Be whatever you want to be inside your prison cell, but we're going to still control the doors, the bars, the amount of food that comes in, the amount of water that comes in, the air you breathe, visitations, communication, etc., which is the situation largely after the 2005 supposed evacuation of Gaza by Israel. And they commit to what is they themselves call a humanitarian minimum. The least amount of calories and the least amount of water and the least amount of other resources that they can let into Gaza that will keep people alive, but nothing above that. By 2006, Hamas wins the election in Gaza. Israel begins withholding taxes in response that it collects for the Palestinian Authority, which has come into being in the meanwhile in this big history to govern in West Bank and other areas. By 2007, Hamas has defeated Fatah in Gaza, become the official representative. This blockade is such that the world is beginning to respond. There are NGOs that try to get aid in through the Mediterranean Sea, flotillas. Israel lets vessels in 6 times, but the 6th time begins to interdict and even kill some of the people on the flotilla. It breaks a 6 month ceasefire that had been worked out in November of that year, begins using white phosphorus for the first time in what becomes known as Operation Cast Lead, which a few months later leaves 13 Jews dead and 1,300 Israelis dead. Israel again recognizes it's got PR problems, hires a white Republican in this country named Luntz to market different ideas to see which ideas gain the clearest purchase in the American mind. And he generates a more than 50-page report. You can get it online and look at all of this stuff. And basically what it says is, Israel, you've got to make sure the narrative talks not about land, but about ideology, not territory, but terror. And every which way, get across the idea that Hamas represents terror and Israel is engaged in self-defense, and no other characterization allowed to gain traction in the US of A. By 2014, you have another, you have resistance going on. You have the suicide bombings begin in 1994. You have rocket attacks begin in 2001. Israel, in Operation Protective Edge, once again sweeps through Gaza. Sometimes in this period, mowing the grass was a trope used by Israel to put down Palestinian resistance. This particular moment leaves 73 Jews dead and 2,300 Palestinians dead. You get Palestinians trying to figure out, what do we do? What do we do? This occupation just continues to decimate and erode and make life impossible for us. Families with kids who, by the age of 14, the sons are saying, Mom and Dad, I don't have a future. I can't get the education I want. I don't have any job prospects. Unemployment in Gaza is 50%. Best thing I can think to do with my life is to throw a rock at a tank and become a martyr. What would you do if that was you as parents with your kids saying that to you? They try nonviolent resistance, the Great March of Return, over the course of better part of 2 years, actually, begins in March of 2018. And 35,000 Palestinians involved. They are sniped at by Israeli soldiers over that period of time, leaving 223 Palestinians dead, 13,000 wounded, often shot through the ankles, so they'll be crippled for life. Israel, on the other hand, experiences 1 dead and 1 wounded. And that leads us up to where we are today, 2023. And real quickly, a couple of profile of the violence, and then a couple questions about language, and then I'll shut up. This is what dead bodies have looked like since 2008. The purple represents Israeli fatalities. The orange represents Palestinian fatalities. And of course, down here at the bottom line, 2023, now 2024 situation, this number's up to 30,000, could be as high as 100,000, according to somebody like Ralph Nader and other folk who are trying to figure who all's still under the rubble. It's at least on average a 1 to 20 ratio. It may be even higher than that. So what is the language by which we look at this history? And whose language is it? Land without people for a people without land? Who's a people and who's not? Who has self-determination? Who doesn't? Who has borders and land? Who has none? Who has jurisdiction? Who depends upon whom? What and who decides? Israel, Palestine. Israel already back under Herzl had identified that it needed to engage in regular propaganda. Herzl asked Zionists to do propaganda starting in 1899. He had the official Hezbollah explaining project, 1984, the Luntz report, 2009. Again, don't talk about territory or land, concentrate on ideology and terrorism. Israel has the right to self-defense. Hamas is engaged in terrorism. You never allow questions like, does Israel engage in terrorism? Do Palestinians have the right to self-defense? You just don't hear that on US media, almost anywhere, at least mainstream media. Video that has been helpful for me, many of us that I hang with, by the Media Education Foundation, The Occupation of the American Mind, recommend looking at that, an hour and a half, which details this concerted attempt to control the narrative, especially in the United States, because that's where the technology, the weapons, the armaments, the bombs come from. Use of language, self-defense presumes you're a people with borders. What can you defend if you have no borders of your own? How do you even talk about self-defense? Terrorism, intentional targeting of civilians for violent killing. So if you bomb a building and say, well, I only intend that the bomb kill enemy combatants. If civilians were in the building, well, they were being used as human shields. Is that no longer intentional? Is that an accurate representation? Are you innocent because you somewhere in your heart supposedly don't intend to kill anybody? You want that bomb to have utter precision to cut down through the 14 floors and only hit the one person you think is associated with Hamas. And you're really sorry that the bomb went AWOL and took out people on other floors who are just civilians. Actually, you get into this question of who's using who as human shields. It's a wide open question. Do Hamas ever do that? Do they ever do that? Probably. But we have pictures of Israeli soldiers rounding up Palestinian teenagers, and as they aggress into Gaza in various places, various periods of time, not just 2023, but 2014, with those kids out in front as a de facto human shield. For me, then looking at this thing in its patterns in relationship to the word terror, if we're going to use the word terror, I'd rather we didn't. I think it's too misleading. We'd be better off in our conversation with each other on all sides about this if we did not use that word. But if we're going to use it, then I think we have to say what goes on in Palestine since 1948 is daily terror for Palestinians, prosaic slow motion terror visited ceaselessly on the Palestinian populace that sooner or later generates reactive terror, provoking a buildup of what eventually explodes into spectacularly reactive terror directed against some proportionately small segment of the Jewish population, which itself results in overwhelming terror. It's instantly enshrined in Israeli media and policies necessity for overwhelmingly, massively suffocating state terror in response. And you can see this pattern repeat itself again and again and again. Final thing here, maybe. You hear from the river to the sea as talked about in the media here as what the Hamas charter is committed to. It goes all the way back to the PLO charter. Yes, that is there. It imagines a single state, democratic vote, one person, one vote for everybody involved, at least in its more recent articulations. But you also find in the right-wing Israeli Likud party, between the sea and the Jordan, there will only be Israeli sovereignty. You have Netanyahu, January 18th, 2024, talking about the area west of the Jordan River will only be populated by Israelis. And in a meeting with Arab state heads in September of 2023, showing a map that reflected that vision of the future. So this idea of Hamas wanting to and Muslims wanting to entirely clear out Jews is exactly what Jews want to do to Palestinians. It's every bit as much an official byword on the Israeli side as the Palestinian side. And the question is, who actually is doing that to whom, and who envisions what in response? The Israeli vision does not envision a state, a democratic state, one person, one vote for non-Jews, but for Jews only. All right, that's, I think, where I need to stop.
Can you,
again, other things are part of it if we wanted to talk about them, but let's just open it up.
can you stop the share so we can see everybody? Yeah. So Laura, you want to moderate the Q&A?
Sure, absolutely.
Mhm.
I'm gonna look at the chat, see if there are any questions. I don't see any direct questions.
Maybe just from the floor?
Sure, yes.
Yeah. Questions, comments, other.
It's a lot to digest, I imagine.
And, up front, I laid out some of the precursors to this, which for me and for Lily are very important, not just to stop with this last 100 years glimpse, but what's behind that and what's behind that and what's behind that.
I think for me, what's really meaningful about this conflict is really 1967 and UN Resolution 242, which insisted on land for peace. And it's my understanding that the Labor Party in Israel was willing potentially to give up some of that land for peace. Whether that would have been a two-state solution, we don't know. But I will say one really key moment here is when far-right Israeli settlers went in. I think they went into Hebron as tourists and took over a hotel and refused to leave. So they were starting this effort to settle the West Bank and create facts on the ground so that the Labor Party could never exchange land for peace, ever. Yeah. So for a long time, this was kind of like a far right thing, and the Israeli Defense Forces had a hard time, really ejecting far right settlers or even fighting back against them when they harmed Israeli Defense Forces. But to me, the really important thing here is that over time, mainstream Israelis started secular settlements in the West Bank. And over time, a lot of mainstream Israelis became committed to keeping the West Bank because, suddenly they own houses there. And all this time, the United States is sending oceans of money to Israel, and that could be interpreted as supporting this settlement strategy. Yeah. And of course, the settlements were designed to prevent Palestinian movement in the West Bank. Yeah. So there's been, slow motion dispossession all along. But I think for me, what's really important right now is that the government of Israel at this moment is further right than it has ever been, ever. Yeah. And so, this is a dream for those far right settlers who really just want to take over the West Bank and Gaza. This is the project. And And can we make it so miserable that Palestinians will finally leave? And how much death is it going to take before they finally go?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think yeah, I'll leave it that there. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
No,
start.
no, that's good. And
Before you
for
respond,
me,
Abe, Sarah, I think, had a question. Sarah Redmond.
Yes, I will just ask it audio wise, but what level of protest in the United States would it take to get the American government to stop supporting the bombing of Gaza, much less the real two-state solution? Is there any level of protest that would do that?
wide open question. I am not prescient about it. I don't know. I mean, I've been involved in protest. I am involved in protest. I I think we do what we can, but to your question, I mean, it's a question for me that's much, much broader than just involvement in Palestine. How do we get the US? How do we get ourselves to recognize we are Israel? And we have won. And they're less than 2% of the population of this country is Native American, but they're still here. And they're still saying, we want you to recognize our Nakba. How do we do that? What level of protest would it take for that? That's something that involved somewhere between 62 million and 145 million folk that we cleared out. So the question about what level of protest, yeah, I'm with you. I don't have a simple answer to it.
You know, I did travel to Palestine in 07 with a Unitarian group. And the first couple days, I thought, well, there's got to be a workaround for some of these issues. And after the first couple days, I said, they have tamped down any possible humanity for the Palestinian people. You know, it's just brutal, just brutal.
Yep.
And that was 07.
And I think what voters did in Michigan last Tuesday was important. Hopefully that will have some effect. I think Biden is at real risk. And it's a real problem because Trump would be even worse, obviously. Alan.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you for your question, Sarah. I would address that question in this way. The protest has already had some effect. We're seeing that. We're seeing that in the way that the Biden administration is now for the first time talking about a ceasefire, not doing anything, but at least changing the language. But what I would suggest is protest has to be clear-eyed about why the United States supports Israel in the first place. And I don't have time at the moment to plumb this deeply, but let me just put it this way. There's a kind of tango going on here of mutual interest, where if we go back all the way to Theodor Herzl, who Jim mentioned, in his pamphlet of 1896, The Jewish State, he talks about how one way in which a future Jewish state could be of service to Western civilization would be to serve as an outpost against barbarism, against Asiatic barbarism. And the British essentially took them up on that. That is the gist of the Balfour Declaration that Jim mentions, which was illegally inserted into the British Mandate in 1922. And what we find is that I think there's a nice little phrase which was expressed by the first British Governor General of Jerusalem, Sir Ronald Storrs, who said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that a Jewish state could serve as a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. And so there was this recognition that a Jewish state could serve as a kind of bastion to protect British interests to the west in the Suez Canal and all the way to the east to their colony in India. And of course, the British Empire fell apart, but now we have the United States. And the United States embraced Israel after the Six-Day War that Jim and Laura talked about. You can see U.S. support for Israel just mushroom after that time because they realized that Israel had a very powerful army. It could defend American interests in the region against all kinds of ne'er-do-wells who might upset the petroleum economies there. And it has been a dance that has been ongoing ever since. We need to identify those interests and address it from that angle as well. And that is scarcely talked about. A lot of young people today are accessing a segment of a speech that Joe Biden made as senator in 1986, where he talks about how if Israel didn't exist, we would have to create it because it serves our interest in the region. And once we begin to talk about the way in which it serves our interests and how that results in just horrible atrocities ongoing, then maybe we can make more progress in addressing the core of the issue, as Jim talks about, our own Nakba and all the rest, American imperialism in general. And for the longest time, we couldn't really talk about those things without being accused of being anti-Semitic. But one of the fortunate developments from this horror is that I think taboo is being broken. And the narrative now is being challenged, and there are new possibilities to talk to people. And ultimately, in a country like ours, that could be a game changer, though it's changing much too slowly. But we're now seeing real possibilities.
And for me, there's a deep question about human beings in all of this and trauma that I also don't have an answer to. You can hear, I think, in what I'm saying, my passion about what's going on, my anger and rage at what is being visited on Palestinians. But I also have passion about what Jewish people experienced over this 2,000-year history, and particularly culminating in the Holocaust. And coming out the other side of that some would say, F this, we are never again going to live at the mercy of people around us who have the laws, have the arms, and have the land. We're going to get land under our feet and arms in our hands. I think that's entirely understandable, and we have to understand that's deeply a part of the picture, quite apart from, right-wing politics. I say probably what should have happened at the end of World War II, that would have been a more just and appropriate way to handle coming out the other side of that obscenity, is for Western powers to have said to Germans, you will provide land for Jewish folk and clear out part of your populace, and they will settle there, and then say to Western Christianity, and you will pay for it. You will pay for all the infrastructure, all the roads, all the housing, all the necessary support to make that happen. That would have landed the responsibility on the actual perpetrators of the violence going on for 2,000 years. But instead, Western powers and Western Christianity shuffled it off on a population, on a piece of land that couldn't resist. And yes, what Alan is saying, and Alan, would you be willing to list those interests in a little note? Just so you mentioned Asian, particular perspective on Asians, of course, oil interests. BP was deeply a part of the outcome of World War I and who got control of what. But I'd be helped if I just had like 3 or 4 lines with those.
Sure. I mean, among them is, the U.S. benefits so much from Israel. We sell arms there. We share intelligence. The Israelis in the past have participated in some of our covert operations. When the U.S. has been unable to sell weapons or provide support to condemned regimes like in Guatemala or El Salvador, Israel has been willing to go in and substitute for us. And then, of course, there is the added layer of Christian Zionism, which we sort of alluded to, but that's a huge force in the country today, and maybe the most significant political force in blocking various sorts of alternative modes that we could be pursuing. And very much wrapped up, of course, in the Trump presidency. And we have a president who openly declares himself a Zionist without having any clue, I think, as to what that actually means.
Since nobody's asking, another piece of this is what's happening right now in the investigation of sexual violence. And
Yeah, joke.
whether that was part of Hamas's plan. There was an Intercept report, Jeremy Scahill and company, that came out February 22nd, actually on Democracy Now! Is where I ran into it, that contested the New York Times entire project, trying to get established that Hamas engaged in this horrendous abuse and torture of women. And the New York Times had to retract its initial story and then retract its online presentation in relationship to that. But then you get the UN coming out this week and saying it has credible evidence of sexual violence engaged in on October 7th, but also saying it's getting reports of Israeli sexual abuse of Palestinian prisoners. And it's kind of an unfolding scenario. I really, given what I know about Israeli propaganda, don't trust what I hear represented about Hamas. On the other hand, that kind of violence often becomes a feature of war. I'm not sure war is the right word for this. Becomes a feature of ongoing collective violence. It wouldn't surprise me if it had gone on to some degree. I've heard one opinion that said it's not part of Hamas, but there were all kinds of other people who came flooding over the border in the wake of Hamas on October 7th, Palestinian gangs and people with an axe to grind who probably did engage in some of those acts. And I also suspect that Israeli treatment of prisoners at times engages in sexual violence. So that's a fraught discussion that is out there that we need to be mindful of as well.
If I could just add to that, I think what was missed in the latest UN report is the UN investigators also asked to have access to the West Bank to talk to Palestinians, and the Israelis flatly said no.
Yep.
No. And that to me is very telling.
That's telling. And they relied on some of the people that were the source for the debunked New York Times report, from what I understand. So how credible is their evidence?
One of the things that I read early on was that the Hamas attack into Israel was to try and get some prisoners to exchange for the prisoners, the Palestinian prisoners held. Why doesn't that get any traction with the media? Well, I guess that's rhetorical, but and they didn't expect to be successful. They kind of thought they were on a suicide mission.
Go ahead, Alan. You look like you.
No, I mean, I have no idea how to answer you, Sarah. I will say this though, and this is touchy, but I'll say it anyways. But if you look at the actual history of Hamas, it is not as, I'm not a defender of Hamas. Their vision is not my vision in any way. But it needs to be said that there have been times in the movement where they've done some things which have not been credited here. Among them, in 2006, they were part of what was called the prisoners document, where prisoners in Israeli control, representing the various factions of the Palestinian resistance movement, like Fatah, like Hamas, like Islamic Jihad, like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, issued this statement where they were trying to intercede in a bubbling conflict between Hamas and Fatah after the legislative elections in Gaza, as Jim talked about in 2006. And what they demanded was that all parties rally around a two-state solution, that there be this agreement that, at least for the time being, we have to live with Israel. We want our own place, so we're going to agree to that. And the Israelis went ballistic because the last thing they want is to share territory with any Palestinian. And the US fell behind them, and that collapsed. The same thing happens in 2014, just before the outbreak of the last horrible mess, Operation Protective Edge, that Jim talked about, where again there was a call for unity government around the principles of recognizing essentially Israel's existence. All previous agreements like UN Resolution 242 that Jim and Laura mentioned, which incidentally does not mention the Palestinians in the language, and agree not to use force and terror anymore. And that also, of course, collapsed. So there have been times in 2017, they did change their charters. They no longer talk about taking territory from the river to the sea and that their enemies are Jews. Their enemies, they say, are Zionists, which are something very different from Jews. I'm a Jew, I'm not a Zionist, so I presume they're not targeting me. But it's a very checkered group, but there has been another way to understand what they're doing. It's much more complicated than we can ever make out in our own media. And our information sources just are not helpful in helping us grapple with the complexity of this conflict and finding a way forward. But we are heavily involved.
And I recall the fact that the powers that be, everybody that was close to the situation, said the election should never be held in Gaza. And yet the US forced the elections, that apparently we wanted to claim that we were able to have free and fair election in Gaza after the Israelis pulled out. And everybody knew that it would end up as it did. And that Netanyahu and company wanted to have Gaza ruled by the worst possible ones, so they would have a worthy enemy that they could go after. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Just real quick comment, and I want Jeff to get in because he's had his hand up for a while. Yeah, I mean, the strategy on Israel's part, as Alan was mentioning, has been to, and Laura was mentioning, to sort of shuttle back and forth between one state, two state, not letting either happen, and the slow erosion ongoing and encroachment on Palestinian areas to ultimately try to get them completely cleared out. And yes, Netanyahu was brokering money from Qatar into Hamas to keep Hamas at odds with the Palestinian Authority, and because that he could then say there's nobody to negotiate with. The Palestinians are themselves divided. I can't negotiate with either side. It doesn't represent them. It's exactly his strategy. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of late for this, but I have a different sort of question. Is that I'm just thinking that so much of the intractability of the conflict just has to do with these really thorny questions of historicity, and I mean that in a couple of different ways. I mean, one just has to do with sort of origins. I mean, Laura calls our attention to 1967, and there's the Nakba in the 40s, and Alan calls our attention to 1896. But Jim's given us this history that goes all the way back, to Exodus, and so one is this sort of question of origins, which is a difficult thing, I think, to narrate and to help people understand in terms of present day politics. But then the second one, which is maybe even more difficult, just has to do with I mean, Jim was talking about indigeneity and sovereignty and claims to land rights. And so much of those competing claims are built upon these conflations between, biblical and, for lack of a better word, actual history. And I'm just like, how do we sort through all of that as a way? I mean, it seems to me like puncturing through that in some way is the most difficult problem of all, and to Well, I'll just stop there.
Right. Yeah. I wish I knew, Jeff. I mean, that's my province, dealing with Christianity, the Bible, all of that stuff. And as Alan mentioned, Christian nationalism, Christian Zionism, white Christian Zionism, or white Christian nationalism, different ways of talking about the phenomenon, is deep at this point in the history of the country, codifying the unresolved Euro trauma coming out of Europe 700 years ago, the closing of the commons, the criminalization of working class, and the witchification of women, all part of that was brought over here, never dealt with, given white supremacy as its buy-off, a fictional identity, and never been dealt with in the history of the country. And now it's being re-invoked, and people whose lives, white folk, particularly working class and to a degree middle class, folk who otherwise are struggling, probably pretty immensely, are given a socially mediated fiction of community that does play into their emotions, wrapped up in Christian discourse. So it becomes a tautology that you can't get inside of because it has an answer to everything, including why you would question it in the first place. And how do you break up that Christian supremacist reading of the Bible from that emotional need and trauma, which is real, so that a different kind of society and different kind of way of dealing with real needs can be worked out? I wish I knew. I mean, I do what I can in rereading the biblical tradition from the ground up as itself a state-produced text that was designed to license land grabs for kings, but has inside of it all of this other memory of people living otherwise and speaking otherwise. And that's, for me, that's the genius of the biblical tradition, but it means you have to learn how to read it against itself. You can make it say anything, and people do. Alan.
Yeah, great question, Jim. Great reply. Great reply, Jim, to Jeff's question. I skirt the question because I don't see it as having a short-term possibility. I appreciate Jim's effort long-term to change discourse and thinking, but right now there's actual suffering and that's just not going to solve it. So I think one way to do so is to simply understand how Israel was created as a state through the United Nations, as Jim noted, and to recognize that the world owes the Palestinians. Their end of the bargain has not been realized, and they're owed. Jim talked about how maybe a more just solution would have been, after 1945, create something in Bavaria. That wasn't done. They decided to do it in Palestine. So the second end of the bargain has to be fulfilled. And if you paid attention to, as I mentioned in Jim's last presentation, to the International Court of Justice hearings, the advisory hearings over the legality of the occupation, there was some stunning presentation. And it's archived on UN Web TV. I know you don't have time, but if you ever do, stunning presentations talking about how there is definitely a way forward through existing international law. And I think the court is going to issue a very powerful statement about the illegality of the occupation, which may again help change narratives and provide a space to move forward. My only question is, what will they recommend? And that I'm not sure, but I think we're being given a chance. And ironically, we're told that one of the reasons for the October 7th attacks was to, again, bring to the fore, to the world's attention, the plight of the Palestinians, where they're going to be ignored in the Abraham Accords and a normalization of relations with Middle Eastern states. And this has really thrown a monkey wrench into all of that. So, the deeper question of biblical interpretation and how to win the hearts and minds of Christians here, I think that's a long-term project. But in the immediate term, I think international law is on the side of the Palestinians. It's against the Israelis, which is why they're terrified of it. And I think that provides a way for all of us to rally around the possibility for at least some sort of justice and an end to this just madness. That's my take.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And which is one other, like, that's super helpful, Alan. I mean, I'm with you 100%. Although in some ways I was also thinking less in terms of winning the hearts and minds of Christian Zionists here than I'm just thinking of, those Israelis who believe that God has promised them this land, and which is justification for ongoing occupation.
Not going to happen.
I know.
Not gonna.
I know.
But they can be marginalized as they once were in their own society. That is a project for Israelis. And if the Israelis realize, as I think some do, not all but some, that their major patron may be dividing over them, they're aware enough that will understand they need to make changes at home that once again marginalizes these millenarian fanatics. Not to put too fine a point on it. I don't think it's something that we can do. It's up to them. Any more than it's their job to change us here. Which is not a very satisfying reply.
I knew there wasn't one.
Well, I think it's been a great discussion, and I have to thank Jim for stepping in at the last minute to offer a presentation on this topic. Thank you, Jim. It was wonderful, and thanks everybody for coming. This is a tough topic, and thank you for everyone who participated and those who are jumping off now. But yes, thanks again. Yay us, and hopefully something good.
And I can make the slides available.
happens.
I'll get that out.
How are you going to send that, Jim?
Probably to my wife.
And then she can share.
Or
Okay.
however, yeah.